By the time 1980 rolled around, General Motors' market share had dropped to around 40% from the mid-50s percentage market share that it enjoyed a few decades earlier. And General Motors was starting to realize that they were having trouble competing in the marketplace. Now, much of the literature and critics will just kind of deride General Motors management as having their head in the sand. They didn't understand the consumer demands. They put out shoddy product in the 1980s. But I will contend that a lot of those arguments are not really representative of the true complexities that GM management was having to deal with as they went through that period, a very significant transitional period in the American auto industry. And we'll try to explore this more in a series of new videos. And while market share would drop to 40% by 1980, by the time General Motors would face bankruptcy, again, several decades later, its market share had plummeted to 20-ish%. So the market share had already decreased significantly, and it was about to experience a precipitous drop as the 1980s progressed. Now, again, while many say that General Motors management wasn't aware of what was going on and really didn't respond or try to respond to changing market conditions, the fact was that there were some very significant changes that GM tried to make in order to enhance its overall organizational structure to try to speed decision-making. The problem was that unfortunately some of them didn't work, but they certainly were well intended. Perhaps one of the most profound changes that General Motors went through during this decade was disbanding its overall divisional structure and Fisher Body Division as well as GM Assembly Division and creating two new organizational structures, the Buick-Oldsmobile-Cadillac Group, otherwise known as BOC, and the Chevrolet-Pontiac-GM Canada Group, otherwise known as CPC. Now, these groups were to be led by two individuals that certainly have name recognition in General Motors history. BOC was led by Bob Stempel, who was a significant engineer, and he'd worked on programs all the way back to things like the Oldsmobile Tornado. Bob Stempel was one of the engineers on the Tornado program when it debuted in 1966. And on the other side of the house, the CPC side, that was going to be led by Lloyd Royce. Now, Bob Stempel would eventually rise to become GM chairman and succeed Roger Smith. Lloyd Royce would become president. And then in relative short order after their respective appointments, they were both either demoted or ousted from the job. And that wasn't entirely of their own doing either. But let's talk a little bit more about the rationale for this BOC-CPC structure. Why did General Motors do this, and what were some of the consequences of it? And was it really kind of the beginning of the end for GM? Well, first, I will say that GM management recognized that they had a problem in the early 1980s, and they felt that they weren't responsive to market conditions, that the company had grown so large. By this time, it was about $65 billion in revenue, which by today's equivalent would be north of $200 billion in revenue, a very, very large company. They thought that it was just too large, in fact, to manage and to be able to make decisions at the level and pace that was required in this rapidly changing environment where there were a significant amount of overseas competitors. So first of all, there was a recognition that they were not able to make decisions as quickly as was needed. And candidly, a lot of the managers felt that a significant portion of this was because the company had simply grown too large. And once it had grown too large, it had a large bureaucratic structure that was bloated. And so anytime you wanted to make a product development change, for instance, let's say you wanted to change an instrument panel, you had to involve in that decision the divisional leadership. If that was a common instrument panel across Buick, Olds, and Cadillac divisions, you had to involve individuals from each of those divisions to change that part. Then on top of the divisional management, you had to involve the supply chain function to make sure that they agreed and could resource the parts. Maybe it was even an internally made GM division parts. You'd have to involve the internal GM division in that. Then once you did that, let's just say it was a internal GM division or an external supplier, you'd have to kick off a renegotiation of the pricing with that supplier. Even internally, GM divisions at this point used to negotiate costs internally amongst themselves. That was how the company operated. And by the way, it's actually how a lot of companies used to operate. Some still operate that way. So that was a whole level of bureaucracy. Then you had to involve a safety team, an ergonomics team, a manufacturing engineering team, a sales and marketing team, and on and on and on, and until it just slowed the decision-making so much that you really couldn't make changes very easily. And so that was a principal reason behind General Motors management wanting to reorganize into the BOC and CPC group, was the thought that they were effectively going to create two autonomous companies that could effectively speed decision-making by cutting the overall bureaucracy in half. That was one of the underlying premises. The other underlying premise was that GM management did in fact recognize that it was having trouble competing in the marketplace, that some of its products weren't as competitive as they needed to be. The 1980 X cars, for instance, which I would contend were about 95% of the way there. If you've driven or ridden in an X car, you'll know that the cars are super compact, and yet they feel spacious and roomy on the inside. They were relatively quiet, especially if you get the V6. I don't know that I would say that about the Iron Duke 4-cylinder, but the overall ride and handling was quite good. Unfortunately, they had rear brake problems, they had power steering rack problems, they had window tape drive regulator problems, they had, well, let's just say a fair number of issues. And if you polled GM management at the time, at least I've talked to some former GM senior leaders of that era, they knew that their products weren't as competitive as they should be. And then the question you might ask is, well, why did they release them into the marketplace? Well, they didn't really have much of a choice. They had to meet corporate average fuel economy standards, which dictated that the U.S. fleet had to achieve, or the company's fleet had to achieve 27.5 miles per gallon by the mid to late 1980s. So the change had to occur. It had to occur at a rapid pace. The entire lineup that GM had to be overhauled from stem to stern. Full-size cars, mid-size cars, compact cars, and it really had to be done over one and at max two model generations, something that the company had never done before. Remember, GM and all of its staffs had historically, if you go back to the 1950s, there was one platform effectively for cars. There was basically full-size cars. That's all that there was in the early, mid, and even really on into some of the later years in the 1950s. But then by the 1960s, you have the introduction of the senior compacts and the intermediate cars. So complexity gets a little bit more significant, although that was a staggered introduction over time of those vehicles. And then by the 1970s, it really was just an improvement on what was already there. And yes, there were some new vehicles that were introduced and even smaller vehicle classes. But by the 1980s, the goal was to redo the entire product lineup from stem to stern. And in order for the cars to achieve higher fuel economy, you needed not only new bodies and componentry, you needed new engines and transmissions. That meant new suspension systems, new brakes, new door hinges, new window regulators, new, you name it, door latches. It all had to be redesigned all at once. And that was something the company was not good at and had never done before in its life. It basically made its reputation. If you think about GM vehicles during its best era, the mid-1960s, they did have some new platforms. Like in 1965, they came out with all new full-size cars. But there was a lot of carryover componentry. The wheels generally had the same bolt circle. The brakes sometimes carried over. The hardware often carried over, like the door handles and latches, and a lot of the different components were reused over time. And by the time that came to the 1980s and this redesign that was required, well, none of that could be true. So it was just totally antithetical to the culture that GM built, really of continuous improvement upon what they were building. So GM management recognized that they had to get faster at decision-making, and they thought that the speed of decision-making could be helped by having those two autonomous organizations, as well as, number two, the competitiveness. By dividing into these two organizations, the thought was, frankly, that these two organizations could compete against one another and could better compete in the marketplace. They were even thinking of selling more and more components externally to generate incremental revenues and, of course, selling to one another as well as a way to kind of foster some internal competition. And that may sound silly, but remember that GM had sold its air conditioning systems, its automatic transmissions, its power steering pumps, its alternators, its starters, and many different components, steering columns, you kind of name it, to other automobile companies who bought them. So the thought wasn't totally crazy that you could have, let's say, more product offerings and better competition, not only internally, but externally. And of course, a third issue that GM was trying to solve was succession planning. Remember, at this time, you had Roger Smith, who was the chairman of General Motors. And when you divide the company up into two like that, you at least create a minimum of two natural successors for the U.S. operations to potentially take over the chairmanship. And that's what eventually happened. As I mentioned, Bob Stempel would win out as the chairman of General Motors eventually. And you also had presidents of the overseas operations, et cetera, that could have been potential contenders. But this at least set GM up to have two very strong competitors based on the performance in the marketplace. And don't forget, I mentioned that when BOC and CPC were created, GM disbanded Fisher Body Division and basically put that responsibility for engineering what Fisher Body used to do back into the BOC and CPC divisions. Same with General Motors Assembly Division. So that workforce went to go work for, and effectively as opposed to Fisher Body or GM Assembly Division, the BOC and CPC groups. And the goal there was to create a smaller but more vertically, let's say, oriented corporate structure. So before this reorganization, the divisional leadership was not responsible for the assembly plants. That was a global group, GM Assembly Division, nor were they responsible for the engineering of the bodies of the car, and that was Fisher Body. So for those who don't know, Fisher Body was responsible for the engineering and building of the body, effectively from the cowl rearward. The division was responsible for building the body from the cowl forward, as well as generally the bumpers of the car, front and rear. So you had two separate engineering groups. Oftentimes you had two separate assembly plants, or at least under the same roof, you'd have a line in the assembly plant that divided the Fisher Body part of the assembly plant from the division plant. You had two totally different groups manufacturing and engineering the vehicles. And so the thought here was, by disbanding Fisher Body as well as GM Assembly Division, that you'd have a more vertically oriented corporate structure within BOC and CPC that would manage basically everything from marketing the vehicles to engineering them to manufacturing. And you could do this more efficiently and more effectively because you'd created a smaller bureaucracy. You didn't have all GM divisions that had this structure. You basically had the BOC group separate from the CPC group. So those are some of the things that were being contemplated as part of the change. The change was executed in 1984. And unfortunately, it didn't work. And what ended up happening? Well, it turns out that by taking what was once a $65 billion corporation, dividing it in two, it's still a big company. It's still kind of lumbering along. And GM just had this relatively large amount of confusion internally because now the Fisher Body engineering staffs were folded into those two organizations, and the roles and responsibilities weren't entirely clear. Who owns what? Remember, this was a huge change for these organizations to sort out. The original vision was for the BOC group to engineer really luxury cars, the CPC group to engineer lower-end cars. But of course, during this time frame, it didn't really matter what platform. The divisions, almost each division got its variant of the platform. So the J cars, as an example, you have the Chevrolet version, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac. The Cavalier, the J2000, later Sunbird, the Olds Forenza, the Buick Skyhawk, as well as the Cadillac Cimarron. So the thought that one of these groups kind of takes the lead, well, they're taking the lead for the entire company, not just the group, the parent group that engineered it, and that created challenges. Then you have, let's say, whatever group created the overall car, was responsible for engineering it, they might charge the other group a fee for doing so. So there was a negotiation basically between the groups of how much were they going to bill one another for engineering various components? What was the price at which they were going to sell components to one another? There was this almost the internal negotiation at GM was almost more intense than the external negotiation with their suppliers, because each GM division had to have a negotiation with the other one to figure out what they were going to sell to one another, what price were they going to sell to one another at. And it sounds crazy, like I said, but back during this time frame, this was relatively commonplace, and there are reasons for this. Some degree of this has to take place because of tax liabilities and calculation of tax liabilities and statutory accounting filings. So it is a necessary evil to some degree, but there are mechanisms for overcoming this in the modern day business world. There just weren't the systems back in the day to do it, and consequently, some of this bureaucracy really just persisted for a long period of time. In fact, that style of management would persist at GM into the 2000s, that kind of inter-company, let's say, markup and negotiation. But you can imagine that it just created a mess of challenges with roles and responsibilities, negotiating these transfer prices, who's responsible for what are their priorities when they're engineering not just for BOC or CPC, but for the whole company. And also a lot of the know-how that was once in Fisher Body, all those best practices were effectively disbanded because BOC wanted its own set, CPC wanted its own set too. So, those are some of the reasons why that structure really, while well-intentioned and seemingly rational, just failed at the end of the day, unfortunately. And I think that really started a snowball effect that GM really had a hard time getting out of, because that bureaucracy that was created forced, as an example, the W cars that finally came out in 1988 after like a 6-year period of gestation, inordinately long, multiple years late. Then that created financial hardship for GM. They were missing out on potential sales, and they actually were moving more slowly to respond to competitive forces than they had before. That led to, in 1992, a significant challenge for General Motors when the boardroom coup happened and a lot of the top management was ousted. And in order to improve profitability after that point, GM started taking more costs out, particularly in the interiors of vehicles. And so you notice that GM interiors in the 1990s are plastic fantastic interiors. And then that creates more hardships because they don't have as many repeat customers and owner loyalty. And it just kind of keeps spiraling. And as a consequence, if I really had to pinpoint an inflection point at which GM really started to fall precipitously, I think it would be that 1984 reorganization and the challenges that GM faced as a consequence of it. Again, it's just a reminder of, despite the best of intentions and well thought out plans, on paper, the CPC BOC reorg tended to make sense. But in execution, it just did not work. And that's one of the reasons that I think General Motors ended up having so much hardship as time went on. What do you think? What do you think of my arguments? Would you agree with me? If anybody was there during this time frame, also put a comment in the comment section and let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching.